Hey everybody, Luke McElroy from Mets Performance Consulting. Welcome back to another episode of the Physiology Secrets podcast. Joined today with Nick Jane Koskis again. Moving on from our detraining podcast the other week, we want to talk about overtraining today, which is obviously the opposite of detraining. I'll throw it straight to you, Nick. Just give us a quick overview of what overtraining is.
Yeah, so overtraining or burnout, or a number of different terms for it, is essentially the process of just, like it says, overdoing. You've done whether it's too much volume, you can overdo it with high intensity, but over a prolonged period of time, you've accumulated too much training load to the point where your body just goes, I've had enough, and essentially wants to go into a bit of shutdown repair mode, and you start to see performance significantly decline. So it's one of the type of things, though, that we quite often can't see overtraining as it's happening. It's more an after the fact you see, all right, where did I go wrong in the program to cause this? And once you're in a state of being overtrained or burnt out, it's kind of you just have to ride the wave out and get yourself back out the other side. It's hard to predict when you're going to become overtrained sometimes, but it's definitely that state. And it happens a lot with athletes, and probably now is a good time to talk about it, where when we talked about the detraining side of things, some athletes might be taking a bit of time off training or not doing as much, because if you're in a lockdown suburb and things like that, you can't get out and do as much. Some athletes who are able to do it, like we think about the athletes who might be up in the country in Victoria at the moment who don't have as many restrictions as down here in Melbourne, they might be going and doing more training than normal, so that could put them at a higher risk of becoming overtrained now rather than losing the adaptation. So they're pushing it, I guess, too far the other end of the spectrum.
Or simply just being stood down from work or whatever it is and having more time available on your hands,
yep.
Take advantage. And a lot of people are doing that, let's take advantage and use the time and get fit. And that's all good and well, and it's just all about that progressive overload. So basically, I've just got the definition on my screen here. Overtraining is an inability to adapt to cumulative fatigue due to inadequate recovery time. So it's doing too much too soon and not recovering enough in between. Yep. So we always talk about load being time, intensity, and frequency. So how long are you training for? Multiply that by some sort of indicator of intensity, whether that's percentage of max heart rate, rate of fatigue exertion.
Percentage of threshold is usually the one
threshold,
TSSI, how much time.
Whatever it is, and then times that by frequency, and that's going to be your weekly training load. So we look at that 2 to 10%. 10% is very aggressive. 2 to 10%. Change in load per week, generally speaking. Right? And you might do two or 3 weeks up, 1 week down to recover. So what's going to happen is, if let's say really simply you're doing 3 times a week, you're going out for a 30-minute jog. Okay, so if you then go, all right, I'm in lockdown, I'm going to go do more training. Let's just do 3 times a week, but let's jump it to 60 minutes. All right. Now, for a lot of people at home, they're like 3 times 60. That's easy. I can do that. But you've got to understand, what is your base load at, and if you're just starting a new training program or whatever it is, and you're not used to that load, that's an aggressive overload. And you might get away with it week 1, week 2, week 10 even. But if you're going to continually go from 30 minutes 1 week, then do 60 the next, then do 90, then 120, that cumulative fatigue is bit by bit going to cause that overtraining. And some of the symptoms of overtraining is persistent fatigue, performance decrement. I'm going to go into the stats about that in a sec. Mood disturbance is a really big one. If you're really irritable, you're not in a good mood at all.
Things like that.
Hormonal alterations, illness susceptibility. That's a massive one for me. I always get the same illness. It's always upper respiratory tract infection. Starts with a sore throat, into a runny nose, into like a chest infection. It's always the same thing. And I know that's whether that's due to overload too much or whether it's inadequate recovery time due to sleep and all that sort of stuff. For me, that's my biggest sign. And you can catch some of those things while looking at resting heart rate and things like that in a sec. Just on that performance decrement, because I've got the stats here, Nick, so I want to go through that quickly. Let me quickly have a look. So performance decrement for overtraining, we are looking at, I'll find it in a sec. Can you go through the difference between overtraining and overreaching, and then I'll come back to that.
I was going to say that there's an important distinction we need to make between overreaching and overtraining, or what we call functional overreaching and overtraining. So as we've already mentioned, the overtraining side of things is that build-up of load too quickly, too aggressively, in inadequate recovery. Sometimes that can be okay, and this is quite often the case when athletes go into things like a training camp. That's the purpose of that, is to do what we call functional overreaching or a strategic overreaching, where we're deliberately providing more stimulus than we actually probably need, or blocking out. You might go on a training camp for a week and doing way more training than you normally would, because that's all you're there for. But then it's followed up with an equal recovery period to sort of match that. So you kind of just banked. You can always think about it, if you've got 1 week training camp, you've almost banked 2 weeks worth of training into the one, and then you have a pretty low deload week following to sort of bounce back out of it. And that's a way of I guess, pushing the stimulus a little bit more, and that's why training camps can be quite effective when done well, is you really aggressively push push the limits of what your body's capable of doing depending on how you do it, but then we have a really big recovery to compensate and bounce us back out.
Yeah.
Whereas the difference being it's overtraining is that, I guess, more chronic accumulation of if you were to go and do one training camp, say you're a triathlete, you did a swimming training camp week 1, and then week 2 you went to a bike training camp, week 3 you had a run training camp, and you've got big load again and again and again, you're doing multiple sessions a day every day for the period of 3 weeks, well, then you're going to be burnt out and overtrained. So if you had adequate recoveries in between, you do training camp, 3 or so weeks of sort of normal, big recovery afterwards, normal, go and do your next training camp. That's probably a better way to do it.
Yep.
But most will have that big training camp. Or even where we see it a lot happen is they'll go to a training camp and then not change anything the following week. They'll come back and just continue as normal in their training and keep trying to build, and that's where it can go quite wrong, because again it's that big accumulation of load well above what you're normally used to in the training camp scenario. Then we haven't really dropped it to compensate. We've just, inadequate recovery afterwards causes that overtraining effect.
Yeah, so overreaching, as you said, that's a good summary, is acute. It lasts for a couple of days to maybe a week where you increase that training load due to a camp, but then it's complemented with adequate recovery time for your body to adapt and recover from that training stimulus, whereas overtraining is a chronic condition. It's basically overreaching, but then constantly doing that without a break.
It's the overreaching without the recovery,
exactly.
essentially.
So overreaching is good. Your body needs to overreach to adapt. You do the same thing, 30 minutes, 30 minutes, 30 minutes, 30 minutes, you're just going to plateau it at that fitness level. So you need to functionally overreach. You need to push yourself up a little bit to adapt, but you don't want to do that chronically. You need to have the up weeks and the down weeks and the recovery time in between that. Signs and symptoms of performance. So this is overtraining. Time to trial performance down 2 to 10%. That's huge. Time to fatigue tests, such as maybe a VO2 max test or something like that. Anywhere from sort of 20 to 30%. Huge. Repeat maximal efforts are down. VO2 max can go down 5 to 8%. Lots of signs and symptoms that often get misconstrued as fitness decrements. Say, I'm not lasting as long on my time trial. I'm not getting as far in a VO2 max or whatever it is. It's a vicious cycle, because what happens is you go out, you're doing your training, you're improving.
They train more then because they're getting worse. Yeah,
exactly right. Then you hit this plateau where I can't get through it, so I need to do more training, less recovery, more training. Now my performance is getting worse. I must have to do more training. And you
overload it more to get better, and then it just cycles, because then it's like you've now had more fatigue,
Correct.
less recovery, and you go again. You just repeat the cycle.
So you've got to be really careful when you are seeing a performance decrement that doesn't match up with the training load you're doing. Have a good hard look at yourself and say, let's have a look. Have a look at your training peaks again. Have a look at the past couple of months training, and are you overloading it too much? So if you should be improving but you're going backwards, it's very likely you're doing some overtraining, and it's something to look at. And the other thing to look at is more detailed signs and symptoms, and I've got it here. I'm going to miss it again.
We'll link this video. I think we linked it in the last podcast.
We did. It's a good video.
We'll link this video. It's at the start of that. I think we call it off-season recovery. It's the beginning of that, talking about this. So we'll link it just to go have another look at.
It was talking about the psychological thing, like all the signs and symptoms. It's not just mood disturbances. It's not just hormonal changes. It's not just fatigue. It's a lot of psychological burnout. Same thing. Psychological fatigue. So like can't be bothered to train, can't get up, just feel really tired. Concentration goes down.
Motivation.
If you turn into a horrible person, you're overtraining. That's obviously exactly. If your personality almost does temporarily alter in certain situations, you're more irritable, you're not feeling yourself, you're not psychologically pumped up for training, it's a good sign. In conjunction with a decrease in performance, it's a pretty good sign that you're overtrained. Anything to add?
I don't think so. I think that's the main part is keep an eye on it, not going past that overreaching, because again, overreaching is okay, but you've got to be strategic about it. Particularly now, and I think that's the critical part right at the moment with a lot of athletes who potentially have more time in their hands, or in your example before of like the alternate example, if you're going out doing 3 30-minute runs, if you go the next week and decide to do 4 runs, well, you've just added, at the same amount of time, you've just added 25% load into the week, or upped it by a quarter. So you've got to be careful about, yes, we have more time, and you might then perceive that as, well, I'm not going to work and doing the other things, so I've got more recovery time. Well, yes, but not really, because if you're still working from home, you've still got other things to do, it potentially isn't going to work that way. You can't just go out and do more training because you can, essentially, because there's more time. You've got to be careful about the loading behind it. Increased risk of injury when you're tired as well, and fatigued. You're not going to get the most out of the session, so you just end up, like we said, just spiralling in this downward spiral or it's in this cycle of it, nothing's really happening, and you just get more and more frustrated with it to the point where your body eventually, in extreme cases, will probably just go, nah, I can't do it anymore, I'm not going to train.
I think that's a good point to make, is that, you know, all training is stress, or a stressor, as we call it, and there's other things that are stressors, life stressors, right? So, you know, a lot of people would have different working arrangements, and you might just be worried or anxious about job security, and that is going to have a load on your body. You might be watching a lot of the news, and it's all bloody doom and gloom at the moment, so that is going to have a stressor on your body. So although the general rule is that 2 to 10% of training load per week increase, that 10% being quite aggressive, 2%, 2 to 5 is sort of what we try to go for.
You've got to consider those other factors.
You've got to consider the other factors, and also understand that this is just a general rule. Some people won't be able to put up with 2 to 10; they might have to do 1%, and others might be able to do 15% because maybe you are getting more sleep and you're actually less stressed about work and all that sort of stuff.
You have to commute and things like that. I know a lot of athletes who are using their normal commuting time where they would do 60 minutes in the car, hour and a half in the car to get to work in the city or whatever. They're now using that to go out for their run in the morning before they start the day, and it might be more beneficial to you during the day to do it that way, a bit more relaxed. It can work in your favour, but you just got to play it well.
I think at the end of the day, the key is just to be able to recognise the signs and symptoms. Whether you're doing 2% or 15% overload, your body is individually going to be able to put up with a, you know, whatever you can put up with, whether that's 2 or 15% or even more. But you've got to look out for the things like increased resting heart rate in the morning, your mood disturbances, sleep disturbances, poor psychological state. You know, you're not motivated. You get the signs. Your performance is decreasing, even though your training load is increasing. These signs and symptoms are a really good way to say, look, you know, maybe we need to do a deload week or even 2 deload weeks. Cut the volume in half, or even sometimes even more. Keep a little bit of intensity in there, and just see how you go. We've done a week or two easy, or less load, and then see how you feel 2 or 3 weeks after that, and you'll probably find, I feel $1,000,000. So whatever strategy you go by, try not to just double your training load. Find what works for you. 2 to 10% is that general rule. Take a look at those signs and symptoms if you want to find them again. It's the same videos we linked last week. We'll do it again. Just cause. Pretty good video, if I do say so myself. Not bad for April 2017. And that's it. Anything else to add?
I don't think so. I think probably, like we said at the start, that like some of those signs and symptoms are you're already overtrained when you start to see those signs and symptoms. So that's probably the key message of all this is, like, if you start feeling any of those coming on, you're probably already overtrained. It's not a sign of overtraining is about to hit. You already are overtrained. So it's the type of thing you act on it early. It's a little bit easier to get out of, rather than you just let it roll and go, I'll just push through it, it's going to be okay. Like with an injury, you have a knee niggle or an Achilles problem, you try to push through and train through it, probably going to end up with something a little bit worse. Similar thing with overtraining.
Awesome. That'll do for today. Hope you enjoyed it. We'll speak to you on the next episode.